I've always believed in the stillness of routine. My name is Daniel, and for 12 years, I've built a life with Claire, my wife, my anchor. We met in college, her laughter cutting through the noise of a crowded lecture hall like a melody I couldn't ignore. She was radiant then, with chestnut hair that fell in waves and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Now, at 35, she's still beautiful, though the years have softened her edges. We live in a modest house on the edge of Portland, surrounded by pines that whisper in the wind. I work as a structural engineer, designing bridges that connect places and people. Claire teaches art at the community college, her hands often stained with paint or charcoal. Our life was predictable. Dinners at 6, weekends hiking, evenings with wine and old movies. I liked it that way, felt safe. But safety, I've learned, is an illusion. Started with the phone. Claire's phone, to be exact. She'd always been casual with it, leaving it on the counter, screen up, no passcode. I trusted her implicitly, never felt the need to snoop. Why would I? We were solid. Or so I thought. One evening, I was in the kitchen, chopping onions for a stew, when her phone buzzed. She was in the shower, the water drumming against the tiles upstairs. I glanced at the screen out of habit, not suspicion. A text from Mark Studio flashed. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about it. My knife paused mid-chop. Mark? Studio? She'd mentioned a Mark once, a colleague who ran the ceramics workshop. I told myself it was nothing. A thank you for a late-night project, maybe. But my gut twisted. A slow knot forming. I didn't say anything that night. Claire came down, hair damp, humming some tune I didn't recognize. She kissed my cheek, commented on the stew's aroma, and we ate like always. But I watched her closer. How she twirled her fork. How her eyes darted to her phone when it buzzed again. I didn't check it that time. Couldn't. My hands shook too much. Instead, I lay awake later, her breathing soft beside me, wondering what incredible meant. Was it a compliment? A memory? Something more? The next day, I called in sick, unusual for me, and sat in my truck outside her college. I saw her laugh with students, her energy bright. Then Mark appeared, tall, lean, with a scruffy beard and a grin that lingered too long. They didn't touch, but their ease stabbed me deeper than any embrace could have. I'm not a man prone to paranoia. I build things, solid, tangible things. Bridges don't lie. They stand or they fall. But Claire's world, her art, her connections, it's all fluid, intangible. After that text, I started noticing threads I'd ignored. She'd been staying late at the studio for weeks, claiming a big exhibition was coming up. I'd nodded, proud of her passion, even brought her coffee once or twice. Now those nights replayed in my mind like a film I couldn't pause. I needed proof, not guesses. So, I became someone I didn't recognize. A man who dug for secrets. I started small. Her phone stayed unlocked, a habit I'd once found endearing. The next morning, while she showered, I scrolled through her messages. Mark's name popped up again and again. Meet me at the loft, one said. You're my muse, another. My stomach churned. There were no replies from her. Just his words, bold and unanswered. Was she ignoring him, or meeting him in silence? I found a photo he'd sent. A clay sculpture of a woman's torso, curves exaggerated, intimate. The caption, inspired by you. My breath caught. Claire's voice called from upstairs, asking if I'd seen her scarf. I shoved the phone back, heart hammering, and lied about the scarf being in the laundry. That afternoon, I drove to the college again. The ceramic studio was a low brick building, windows streaked with dust. I parked far enough to watch without being seen. Claire emerged at dusk, her coat pulled tight against the chill. Mark followed, locking the door. They stood close, too close, her hand brushing his arm as she laughed. Then she got in her car and drove home. To me, I sat there, gripping the wheel, feeling the world tilt. That night, she cooked salmon, her hands steady as she seasoned it. I ate in silence, tasting nothing. She asked if I was okay. Just tired, I said. But I wasn't tired. I was unraveling. I needed more than glimpses. I needed the truth, raw and unfiltered. So I followed her. It was a Thursday, her late night at the studio. I told her I had a project meeting, kissed her forehead, and left. Then I doubled back, parking a block from the college. She didn't drive home at 8 like she'd said. Instead, she walked to a loft downtown, a rented space artist used all exposed brick and dim lights. I watched from across the street as she knocked. Mark opened the door, shirt unbuttoned, a glass of wine in hand. She stepped inside, and the door closed. I could have stormed in, demanded answers. But something held me, curiosity maybe, or dread. I waited. An hour later, the lights dimmed. My mind raced, painting scenes I couldn't unsee. Then the door opened, and out came Mark, followed by Claire and a woman I didn't know. She was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and a sharp jaw. They were laughing, casual, like friends after a drink. Claire hugged the woman, then Mark, and drove off. I sat there, confused. Was this an affair? A meeting? I needed more. The next day, I hacked her email. Guilt gnawing at me, but desperation winning. I found a thread with Mark, buried in her archives. The ritual worked, he'd written. She's perfect. Next time, bring the oils. Claire's reply, I can't believe it felt so right. She's ours now. My blood ran cold. Oils? Ritual? I dug deeper, finding photos. Claire, Mark, and the silver-haired woman, naked but painted in swirling patterns. A clay figure between them. It wasn't intimacy in the usual sense. It was something stranger, a shared creation, a betrayal of me through art and flesh. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I carried the knowledge like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold. Claire moved through our days unaware, smiling, touching my hand, asking about my work. I nodded, played along, but every word she spoke felt like a mask. What was this ritual? Was it emotional, physical, spiritual? I searched online, X-posts, obscure forums, finding whispers of artists blending bodies and clay, a niche subculture where muses became more than inspiration. It wasn't about love or lust with Mark. It was about possession, creation, a bond one couldn't touch. I watched her closer. She started bringing home sculptures, small, twisted figures with hollow eyes. Students' work, she'd say, but I recognized her style in the curves. One night, I found a jar of oil in her bag, scented, thick, unmarked. It matched the photos. I smelled it, and my skin crawled. She was still meeting them, I knew it. I followed her again, this time to a warehouse. Through a cracked window, I saw it. Claire, Mark, the woman, circling a clay figure, hands slick with oil, chanting softly. They weren't lovers. They were makers, and Claire was giving herself to it, her mind, her body, her soul. To me, it was worse than any affair. I drove home shaking. She came back at midnight claiming a flat tire. I didn't challenge her. Instead, I planned. She'd betrayed me. Not with a man, but with this bizarre, consuming art. I couldn't compete with it, but I could destroy it. I started small, tracking their schedules, mapping the loft, the warehouse. I bought tools not for bridges but for ruin. Claire didn't notice my distance. She was too deep in her world, and I was sinking into mine. Revenge isn't a word I'd ever lived by. I fix things, not break them. But Claire's betrayal, her surrender to the strange trio and their clay gods, lit something dark in me. I didn't want her back. I wanted her to feel what I felt. Loss, violation, rage. I spent days researching their ritual. X-posts led me to a ceramic supplier. They used high-grade clay, oils from a local apothecary. I visited the shop, bought the same oil, studied its scent. It was their signature, their bond. I'd use it against them. I began with Mark. He was the catalyst, the one who'd texted her first. I found his address online, a rundown apartment near the river. I waited until he left for the studio, then broke in. No locks could stop a man who builds for a living. Inside, I found shelves of sculptures, grotesque, beautiful things. I smashed one, then another, grinding them to dust with a hammer. I left a note, She's not your muse anymore. Let him wonder. Let him sweat. Next, I targeted the woman, Eleanor. I'd learned her name from Claire's emails. She owned the loft. I mailed her a package. Clay dust mixed with oil. A photo of their ritual I'd printed. And a single word, enough. She'd know someone was watching. Claire was last. I didn't touch her yet. I wanted her to see the others crumble first. That night, she came home rattled. Mark had called, upset about his studio. Vandals, she said, eyes wide. I feigned concern, poured her wine, watched her sip it. She didn't suspect me. Not yet. But I was just beginning. I'd unravel their world, piece by piece, until Claire had nothing left to give them. Then she'd face me, and the cruelty I'd perfected. I've never been a man of chaos, but there's a strange thrill in watching something break apart. After Mark's sculptures turned to dust and Eleanor got my little gift, I felt the first tremor in their world. Claire came home the next night, her face tight with worry. Mark's a mess, she said, stirring soup on the stove. Someone trashed his place. Years of work gone. Her voice trembled, and I almost pitied her. Almost. I asked questions, innocent ones, about who could have done it, what it meant. She shrugged, distracted, her fingers tapping the counter. Eleanor's spooked too, she added. Got some weird package. She thinks it's connected. I nodded, hiding the curl of satisfaction in my chest. I kept moving. Mark's loss was a start, but Eleanor's loft was their sanctuary, the heart of their rituals. I scouted it at night, a hulking shadow downtown. The back door was flimsy, a weak latch I could pry with a crowbar. I waited for a rainy evening, the downpour masking my steps. Inside, the air smelled of clay and oil, thick and cloying. Their latest creation sat on a pedestal, a towering figure, half human, half beast, painted in swirling reds and golds. Claire's brushstrokes were all over it. I'd know her style anywhere. I didn't smash it. Too obvious. Instead, I poured turpentine over it. Slowly, letting it seep into the clay, softening it to mush. By morning, it'd be a ruin. Their art dissolved. I left a trace. Another note, tucked under a jar of oil. You can't hold her. Let them guess who her was. Claire, the muse? The figure? Me unraveling their grip? I didn't care. I wanted them paranoid, turning on each other. When Claire got home that night, she was pale. The loft's a disaster, she whispered. Our piece, it's gone. Just melted. She looked at me, searching for comfort. I gave her a hug, my arms stiff, my mind racing. She didn't know I was the storm. Not yet. But I saw the cracks, her trust in her partners fraying, her confidence shaken. It was only the beginning. Claire started unraveling, and I tightened my grip. She spent hours on the phone with Mark and Eleanor, their voices faint through the walls as I pretended to read in the den. It's targeted, I heard her say once. Someone knows. She was right, of course, but she didn't look at me twice. I'd become invisible, a shadow in my own home, plotting under her nose. I fed her doubt, subtle at first. Maybe it's an old student, I suggested over breakfast. Someone jealous of your work. Her eyes narrowed, considering it, and I planted the seed deeper. Or someone closer. You trust Mark, right? She hesitated, just a flicker, but it was enough. I turned to Mark next. He was fragile now, his bravado cracked. I found his car outside the studio one evening, a beat-up sedan with a loose license plate. I didn't touch the car itself, too traceable. Instead, I slipped into the studio again, this time with a plan. He'd started rebuilding, small figures lining his shelves. I took one, a delicate bird, and replaced it with a crude copy I'd made from cheap clay, smeared with their ritual oil. It was sloppy, obvious, a taunt. I left another note. You're replaceable. He'd see it and wonder, was it Eleanor? Claire? A rival? I wanted him spinning, distrust blooming like rot. Eleanor was harder. She was sharp, suspicious, locking the loft tighter after my last visit. But I found her weakness, her pride. She'd posted about their art collective on X, boasting about resilience. I made a burner account, commented, "Resilience? Your work's falling apart." Literally. I attached a photo of the melted figure, snapped before I left that night. She deleted it fast, but the damage was done. Her followers saw, whispered. Claire mentioned it days later, frustrated. "Eleanor's obsessed with some troll online," she said. "It's tearing us apart." I smiled into my coffee. Good. Let it tear. Claire's world was shrinking, and I was the spider at its center. She stopped bringing sculptures home, her hands clean of clay for the first time in years. She'd sit at the table, staring at nothing, her phone silent. Mark and Eleanor weren't calling as much. I'd driven wedges between them. Mark thought Eleanor was sabotaging him. Eleanor suspected Mark's carelessness. And Claire? She was caught questioning both. I fed her isolation, casual but cutting. "You seem lonely lately," I'd say. "Where's your crew?" She'd mumble excuses. Stress, deadlines, and I'd nod, knowing I'd stripped her of them. I escalated with Eleanor. She'd hired a locksmith, but I didn't need doors anymore. I found her apothecary supplier, an old hippie named Ruth who mixed their oils. I visited Ruth, posed as a buyer, and accidentally spilled a story. Heard some artists got sloppy. Ruined a batch with bad clay. Ruth gossiped, as I'd hoped, and soon Eleanor's oil order was lost. No oil, no rituals. Claire complained about it one night, pacing. "Everything's falling apart," she said. "Eleanor's furious, Mark's useless." I listened, calm, while my pulse thrummed with victory. Mark got desperate. I saw him at a bar downtown, drinking alone. I joined him, coincidence I claimed, bought him a beer. "Rough week?" I asked. He spilled it all. The break-ins, the ruined work, Eleanor's distance. "Claire's the only steady one," he slurred. I leaned in, voice low. "Is she?" "She's been off lately, secretive." His eyes widened, doubt sinking in. I left him there, drowning in it. By morning, Claire got a frantic call from him, accusing her of something. I didn't hear what. She hung up, trembling. "He's lost it," she said. I held her, hiding my grin. The web was tightening. Claire was a shell now. Quiet, withdrawn, her spark dimmed. She'd stopped going to the studio, claiming she needed a break. I saw the truth. She had nothing left to give them. Mark and Eleanor were unraveling, and she couldn't hold them together. I'd done that. Me. But I wasn't finished. I wanted her to feel the betrayal I'd felt. Not just lose her art, but lose herself in it. I started at home. Her studio in the garage, once her sanctuary, was my next target. She hadn't touched it in weeks, dust settling on her tools. I waited until she left for groceries. Then I went in. Her shelves held old pieces. Vases, figures, memories of us. I didn't smash them. Too loud. Instead, I mixed her clay with sand. Gritty, useless. Repacked it in her bins. Her paints got a dose of water, thinning them to pale ghosts. When she worked again, it'd fail her. Every stroke of frustration. I left one sculpture untouched. A bust of me she'd made years ago. Let her see it and remember what she'd thrown away. She came back, oblivious, and I watched her over days. She tried painting once, frowned at the runny colors, blamed herself. "I'm off," she muttered. I agreed softly, letting her sink deeper. Outside, I mailed Mark a package. Clay dust from his ruined bird, a photo of Claire laughing with Eleanor, and a note. She chose her. Let him stew. Eleanor got a call, from a burner I'd bought. My voice disguised, "Mark's selling your secrets." She'd check, find nothing, but the seed was planted. Claire noticed their silence, her phone dead. "They've abandoned me," she said, voice breaking. I held her hand, cold as stone, and planned the final blow. I wanted Claire to see herself, really see what she'd become. Not the artist, not the muse, but the hollow thing I'd made her. I staged it carefully. Mark and Eleanor were broken, their trust shattered, but I needed them for this. I sent them each a letter, forged in Claire's handwriting, lifted from old notes she'd left me. To Mark, "Eleanor's right, you're weak. I'm done." To Eleanor, "Mark's right, you're controlling. It's over." I added a meeting time, the warehouse, midnight, and a promise of closure. They'd show up, expecting her. She wouldn't be there. I took Claire out that night, dinner a rare treat. She was quiet, picking at her food. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, barely. I drove her past the warehouse after, slow enough to see Mark and Eleanor arguing outside, shadows in the dark. "What's that?" I said, feigning surprise. She squinted, recognized them, and paled. "They're fighting," she whispered. "Because of me." I didn't answer, let her stew. At home, she sat on the couch, hands trembling. "I've lost them," she said. I knelt beside her, voice soft. "Maybe they lost you first." That night, I finished it. I'd kept photos, their rituals, her painted body, their clay gods. I printed them, dozens, and scattered them in her studio. When she woke, she'd find them. A mirror of her betrayal, twisted by my hand. She'd see the ruin I'd wrought, and know it was hers too. Revenge wasn't loud. It was this quiet, cruel, complete. Morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of day that presses down on you. Claire slept late, her breathing uneven beside me. I'd barely closed my eyes, adrenaline still humming from the night before. The photos waited in her studio, silent witnesses to her betrayal, my revenge. I made coffee, the routine a mask, and watched her shuffle downstairs. She looked fragile, her eyes shadowed, her hands clutching a sweater like armor. "I'm going to work on something," she mumbled, heading for the garage. I nodded, sipping my coffee, counting the seconds. Her scream came 10 minutes later. Sharp, raw, a sound I'd never heard from her. I didn't rush. I walked, calm, and found her in the studio, photos scattered at her feet. She held one, her body painted, Mark's hands on clay, Eleanor's eyes gleaming. "What is this?" she whispered, turning to me. Her voice cracked, fear and confusion warring in it. I stepped closer, looked at the photo, then at her. "Looks like art," I said, flat. "Your art." She shook her head, dropping it, grabbing another. No, this isn't. I didn't." She stopped, staring at me. "Did you do this?" I didn't answer. I let her fill the silence, her mind spinning. "Someone's been watching us," she said, frantic. "Mark's place, Eleanor's loft. Now this. It's all connected." She was close, so close, but she didn't see me yet. I shrugged. Maybe someone got tired of being left out. Her eyes widened, searching mine, but I turned away, left her with the mess. She spent the day there, pacing, muttering, trying to piece it together. I heard her call Mark, then Eleanor. Both calls short, tense, unanswered. They were done with her. I'd made sure of that. Claire stopped eating. She'd sit at the table, staring at her plate, her fork untouched. I cooked anyway. Elaborate meals, steaks and roasted vegetables. A cruel mimicry of our old life. "You need strength," I'd say, sliding a plate toward her. She'd nod, push it away. Her phone stayed dark. Mark and Eleanor had cut her off, their trust poisoned by my letters. She tried the studio once, came back furious. Her clay gritty, her paints useless. "It's ruined," she said, voice hollow. "Everything's ruined." I watched her, silent, letting it sink in. I kept the pressure on. I mailed Mark a final taunt. Another photo, this one of Claire alone, oil-slicked with a note. "She's free now." He wouldn't respond, but he'd fester. Eleanor got a call. My burner again, a whisper. "She's laughing at you." I knew she'd check X, find nothing, but doubt would gnaw. Claire felt it too, their absence, the silence. She cornered me one night, eyes wild. "Did I do something?" she asked. "They won't talk to me. It's like I don't exist." I tilted my head. "Maybe you don't. Not to them." She cried then, the first time in weeks. I didn't comfort her. I stood there, watching her break, feeling the weight of my work. Her betrayal had been strange. Clay and oil, a bond one couldn't touch. Mine was colder, sharper. I'd taken her world apart, left her alone in the wreckage. That night, she slept on the couch, curled tight. I went to the garage, gathered her ruined tools, and started planning the end. She'd see soon not just the loss but the why. I wanted her to know it was me, to feel the betrayal twist both ways. I didn't need words to confess. Actions would do. Claire was a ghost now, wandering the house, avoiding the studio, her spirit drained. I decided to show her the threads I'd pulled, let her connect them herself. I started subtle. I left my truck keys on the counter, the crowbar still tucked in the back. Flecks of clay on it, a hint from the loft. She noticed, frowned, but said nothing. Next, I forgot my burner phone on the table. The call log open, Eleanor's number, Mark's. She picked it up, stared, then set it down like it burned. That night, I staged the reveal. She was in the living room, staring at the TV, off, blank. I brought a box from the garage, set it beside her. Inside were scraps, clay dust from Mark's shelves, a vial of their oil, a photo of the melted figure. Found this cleaning, I said casual. Thought it might mean something to you. Her hands shook as she opened it, pulling out each piece. She didn't speak, but her eyes darted, fear, realization. Where did you get this? She whispered. I shrugged. Around. She stood, backing away, the box tipping over. Clay dust spilled across the floor, a gray stain. It was you, she said, voice breaking. All of it, the studio, the loft, them. I didn't deny it. I met her gaze steady, letting her see the man she'd made. Why? She asked, tears streaking her face. I stepped closer, voice low. You gave yourself to them, left me behind. I took it back. She sank to the couch, sobbing, and I left her there. The truth was out, sharp as a blade, cutting deeper than any shout. Claire didn't fight back. I'd expected anger, accusations, something, but she just collapsed inward. She stopped leaving the house, stopped speaking beyond murmurs. I'd broken her world, and now she lived in its ashes. I wasn't done, though. Revenge isn't complete until the lesson sticks. I turned to Mark and Eleanor one last time. I sent them each a package, identical, heavy. Inside, a lump of ruined clay, a photo of Claire from the ritual, and a note in her forged hand. I chose him. Let them think she'd betrayed them for me, the final twist. Mark cracked first. I saw it on X. He posted a rant, cryptic, about trust and loss, then went silent. Eleanor held longer, but her supplier cut her off. My doing, a quiet word to Ruth about unreliable clients. Their art died, their bond with it. Claire felt the echo. She found the packages in the trash. I'd left them there, careless, and stared at the notes. What did you do? She asked, voice faint. I smiled, cold. What you did to me. She moved out that week, not far, a cheap apartment downtown. I let her go, didn't chase. But I visited once, uninvited. She opened the door, thin, pale, her eyes dead. Leave, she said. I didn't. I set a sculpture on her table, the bust of me, the one she'd made, pristine amid her ruin. Keep it, I said. Remember. She didn't touch it, just watched me leave. I'd taken everything, her art, her friends, herself. She'd live with that, a mirror to my pain. Months passed. I stayed in our house, the pines still whispering outside. Claire's absence was loud at first. Empty chairs, quiet nights, but I adjusted. I built bridges again, my hands steady, my mind clear. She didn't recover. I heard through mutual friends. She'd quit teaching, stopped creating, lived small and gray. Mark moved away. Eleanor vanished into obscurity. Their trio, their strange rituals, gone. I'd erased them, brick by brick, and Claire bore the weight. I saw her once, downtown, buying bread. She didn't see me. Her hair was dull, her steps slow, the muse I'd loved reduced to a shadow. I felt no pity, only a grim satisfaction. She'd betrayed me. Not with bodies, but with something deeper, and I'd turned it back on her. The bus stayed in her apartment, I'd bet, a silent judge. My revenge was cruel, yes, but complete. She'd never forget, and neither would I. That was enough.